Source: Changes in perception. The glass is half full. In mathematics, there is no difference between the glass is half full and the glass is half empty. But the meaning of these two statements is totally different, and so are their consequences. If general perception changes from seeing the glass as half full to seeing it as half empty, there are major innovative opportunities. Here are a few examples of such changes in perception and of innovative opportunities. They opened up in business, in politics, in education, and elsewhere. Number one, all factual evidence shows that the last 20 years, the years since the early 1960s, have been years of unprecedented advance and improvement in the health of Americans. Whether we look at mortality rates of newborn babies or survival rates for very old, at occurrence of cancers other than lung cancer, or cure rates for cancer, and so on, all indicators of physical health and functioning have been moving upward at a good clip. And yet, the nation is still gripped by collective hypochondria. Never before has there been so much concern with health and so much fear. Suddenly, everything seems to cause cancer or degenerative heart disease or premature loss of memory. The glass is clearly half empty. What we see now are not the great improvements of health and functioning, but that we are as far away from immortality as ever before and have made no progress towards it. In fact, it can be argued that if there is any real deterioration in America's health during the last 20 years, it lies precisely in the extreme concern with health and fitness. The obsession with getting old, with losing fitness, with degenerating into long-term illness or senility. 25 years ago, even minor improvements in the nation's health were seen as major steps towards forward. Now even major improvements are barely paid attention to. Whatever the causes for this change in perception, it has created substantial innovation opportunities. It created, for instance, a market for health care magazines. One of them, American Health, reached a circulation of 1 million within 2 years. It created the opportunity for a substantial number of new and innovative businesses to exploit the fear of traditional foods and causing irreparable damage. A firm in Boulder, Colorado, named Celestial Seasonings was started by one of the flower children of the late 60s, picking herbs in the mountains, packing them, and peddling them on the streets. 15 years later, Celestial Seasons was taking in several $100 million in sales each year and was sold for more than $20 million in a very large processing company. And there are highly profitable chains of health food stores. Jogging equipment has also become big business, and the fastest growing new business in 1983 in the United States was a company making indoor exercise equipment. Traditionally, the way people feed themselves was very largely a matter of income group and class. Ordinary people ate, the rich dined. This perception has changed within the last 20 years. Now the same people both eat and dine. One trend is toward filling, which means getting down the necessary means of substance in the easiest and simplest possible way. Convenient foods, TV dinners, McDonald's, hamburgers, or Kentucky Fried Chicken, and so on. But then the same consumers have also become gourmet cooks. TV programs on gourmet cooking are highly popular and achieve high ratings. Gourmet cooks have become mass market bestsellers. Whole new chains of gourmet food stores have opened. Finally, traditional supermarkets, while doing 90% of their business in food for feeding, have opened gourmet boutiques, which in many cases are far more profitable than the ordinary processed food business. This new perception is by no means confined to the United States. In West Germany, a young woman physician said to me recently, Warsaw in der Roche, Abend einen Tag wollen wir Deutsch Richtag sprechen. We feed 6 days, but 1 day a week we like to dine. Not so long ago, Essen was what ordinary people did 7 days a week, and Spießen was the elite, the rich, and the aristocracy did 7 days a week. If anyone around 1960, in the waning days of the Eisenhower administration and the beginning of the Kennedy presidency, had predicted the gains the American back would make in the next 10 or 15 years, he would have been dismissed as unrealistic, visionary, if not insane. Even predicting half the gains that those 10 or 15 years actually registered for the American black would have been considered hopelessly optimistic. Never in recorded history has there been a greater change in the status of social group within a shorter time. At the beginning of those years, black participation in higher education beyond high school was around 1/5 of whites. By the early 70s, it was equal to that of whites, and ahead of that of a good many white ethnic groups. The same rate of advance occurred in employment and income, and especially in entrance to professional and managerial occupations. Anyone granted 12 or 15 years ago in advance would have considered the Negro problem in America to be solved, or at least pretty far along the way towards solution. But what a large part of American black population actually see today in the mid-80s is not the glass has become half full, but that it is half empty. In fact, frustration, anger, and alienation has increased rather than decreased from a substantial fraction of American blacks. They do not see the achievement of 2/3 of the blacks who have moved into the middle class, economically and socially, but the failure of the remaining 1/3 to advance. What they see is not how fast things have been moving, but how much still remains to be done, how slow and how difficult the going still is. The old allies of American blacks, the white liberals, the labor union, the Jewish community, and academia see the advances. They see the glass has become half full. This has led to a basic split between the blacks and the liberal groups, which, of course, only makes the blacks feel even more certain that the glass is half empty. The white liberals, however, has come to feel that the blacks increasingly are no longer deprived, no longer entitled to special treatment such as reverse discrimination, no longer in need of special allowances and priority in employment, in promotion, and so on. This because the opportunity for a new kind of black leader, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, historically for almost 100 years from Booker T. Washington, around the turn of the century, through Walter White in the New Deal days until Martin Luther King Jr., during the presidencies of John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, a black could become leader of his community only by proving his ability to get the support of white liberals. It was the one way to obtain enough political strength to make significant gains for American blacks. Jesse Jackson saw that the change in perception that now divided American blacks from their old allies and comrades in arms, white liberals, is an innovative opportunity to create a totally different kind of black leadership, one based on vocal enmity to the white liberals and even all-out attack on them. In the past, to have sounded as anti-liberal, anti-union, anti-Jewish, as Jackson has done, would have been political suicide. Within a few short weeks in 1984, it made Jackson the undisputed leader of the American black community. American feminists today consider the 1930s and the 1940s the darkest of dark ages, with women denied any role in society. Factually, nothing could be more absurd. The America of the 1930s and the 1940s was dominated by female stars of the first magnitude. There was Eleanor Roosevelt, the first wife of American president to establish for herself a major role as a conscience and as a voice of principle of compassion with which no American male in our history has equaled. Her friend, Frances Perkins, was the first woman in America's cabinet as Secretary of Labor and the strongest, most effective member of President Roosevelt's cabinet together. Anna Rosenberg was the first woman to become a senior executive of a very big corporation as personal vice president of R.H. Macy, then the country's biggest retailer, and later on, during the Korean War, she became Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower and the boss of the generals. There were any number of prominent and strong women as university and college presidents, each a national figure. The leading playlist, Claire Booth Luce and Lillian Hellman, were both women, and Claire Luce then became a major political figure, a member of Congress from Connecticut, and ambassador of Italy. The most publicized medical advance of the period was the work of a woman. Helen Taussig developed the first successful surgery of the living heart, the Blue Baby operation, which saved countless children all over the world and ushered in the age of cardiac surgery, leading directly to the heart transplant and the bypass operation. And there was Marian Anderson, the black singer and the first black to enter every American living room through the radio, touching the hearts and conscience of millions of Americans, and no black before her had done and none would do any until Martin Luther King Jr. a quarter century later. The list would be continued indefinitely. These were very proud women, conscious of their achievements, their prominence, their importance, yet they did not see themselves as role models. They saw themselves not as women, but as individuals. They did not consider themselves as representatives, but as exceptional. However, the change occurred and why, I leave to future historians to explain. But when it happened around 1970, these great women leaders became, in effect, non-persons for their feminist successors. Now the woman who is not in the labor force and not working in an occupation traditionally considered male is seen as unrepresentative and as the exception. This was noted as opportunity by a few businesses in particular. Citibank, Chapter 7. It was not seen at all, however, by the very industries in which women had long become accepted as professionals and executives, such as department stores, advertising agencies, magazines, or book publishers. These traditional employers of professional and managerial women actually today have fewer women in major positions than they had 40 years ago. Citibank, by contrast, was exceedingly macho, which may be one reason why it realized there had been a change. It saw the new perception women had of themselves a major opportunity to court exceptionally able, exceptionally ambitious, exceptionally striving women, to recruit them and to hold them, and it could do so without competition from the traditional recruiters of women, career women. In exploiting a change in perception, innovators, as we have seen, can usually count on having the field to themselves for quite a long time. A much older case, one from the early 1950s, show a similar exploitation of a change in perception. Around the 1950s, the American population began to describe itself overwhelmingly as being middle class, and to do so regardless almost of income and occupation. Clearly, Americans had changed their perception of their own social position. But what did the change mean? One advertising executive, William Benton, later senator from Connecticut, went out and asked people what the words middle class meant to them. The results were unambiguous. Middle class, in contrast to working class, means believing in the ability of one's children to rise through performance in school. Benton thereupon bought up the Encyclopedia Britannica company and started peddling the encyclopedia, mostly through high school teachers and parents whose children were the first generation in the family to attend high school. If you want to be middle class, the salesman said, in effect, your child has to have the Encyclopedia Britannica to do well in school. Within 3 years, Benton had turned the almost dying company around, and 10 years later, the company began to apply exactly the same strategies in Japan for the same reason and with the same success. Unexpected success or unexpected failure is often an indication of change in perception and meaning. Chapter 3 told how the phoenix of the Thunderbird rose from the ashes of the Eisel. What the Ford Motor Company found when it searched for an explanation of the failure of Eisel was a change in perception. The automobile market, which only a few short years earlier had been segmented by income groups, was now seen by the customers as segmented by lifestyles. When a change in perception takes place, the facts do not change. Their meaning does. The meaning changed from the glass is half full as working class and therefore born into one station in life to seeing oneself as middle class, therefore very much in command of one's social position and economic opportunities. This change can come very fast. It probably did not take much longer than a decade for the majority of the American population to change from considering themselves as working class to considering themselves middle class. Economic does not necessarily dictate such changes. In fact, they may be irrelevant. In terms of income distribution, Great Britain is a more egalitarian country than the United States, and yet almost 70% of the British population still consider themselves working class, even though at least 2/3 of the British population are above working class. Income by economic criteria alone, and close to half are above the lower middle class as well. What determines whether the glass is half full or half empty is mood rather than facts. It results from experiences that might be called existential, that the American blacks feel the glass is half empty has much to do with unhealed wounds of past centuries. As with anything in present American society, that a majority of English feel themselves to be working class is still largely a legacy of the 19th century, chosen between church and chapel, and the American health hypochondria expresses far more American values such as worship of youth than anything in the health statistics. Whether sociologists or economists can explain the perception phenomenon is irrelevant. It remains a fact. Very often, it cannot be qualified, or rather, by the time it can be qualified, it is too late to serve an opportunity for innovation. But it is not exotic or tangible. It is concrete. It can be defined, tested, and above all, exploited. The problem of timing. Executives and administrators admit that potency of perception-based innovation, but they tend to shy away from it as not practical. They consider the perception-based innovator as weird or just a crackpot. But there is nothing weird about Encyclopedia Britannica and the Ford Thunderbird of celestial seasonings. Of course, successful innovators in any field tend to be close to the field in which they innovate. But the only thing that sets them apart is their being alert to opportunity. One of the foremost of today's gourmet magazines was launched by a young man who started out as a food editor of an airline magazine. He became alert to the change in perception when he read the same issue of a Sunday paper, 3 contradictory stories. The first said that prepared meals such as frozen dinners, TV dinners, and Kentucky Fried Chicken accounted for more than half of all meals consumed in the United States and were expected to account for 3/4 within a few years. The second said that TV program on a gourmet cooking was receiving one of the highest audience ratings. And then third, the gourmet cookbook in the paperback edition, that is an edition for the masses, had mounted to the top of the bestsellers list. These apparent contradictions made him ask, what's going on here? A year later, he started a gourmet magazine quite different from any that had been on the market before. Citibank became conscious of the opportunity offered by the women in the workforce when its college recruiters reported that they could no longer carry out their instructions, which were to hire the best male business school students in finance and marketing. The best students in these fields, they reported, were increasingly women. College recruiters and many other companies, including quite a few banks, told their managers the same story at that time. In response, most of them were urged, just try harder to get to the top flight. Men at Citibank, top management saw the change as an opportunity and acted on it. All these examples, however, also showed the critical problem in perception-based innovation. Timing. If Ford had waited only 1 year after their fiasco of Edsel, it may have lost the lifestyle market to GM's Pontiac. If Citibank had not been the first one to recruit women MBAs, it would have not become the preferred employer for the best and most ambitious of the young women aiming to make a career in business. Yet, there is nothing more dangerous than to be premature in exploiting a change in perception. In the first place, a good many of what look like changes in perception turned out to be short-lived fads. They are gone within a year or two, and it is not always apparent which fad and which is true. The kids playing computer games were a fad. Companies which, like Atari, saw in them a change in perception lasted 1 or 2 years and then became casualties. Their fathers going in for home computer represented a genuine change. However, it is furthermore almost impossible to predict what the consequences of change, such a change in perception, will be. One good example are the consequences of the student rebellion of France, Japan, West Germany, and the United States. Everyone in the late 1960s was quite sure that these would have permanent and profound consequences. But what are they? As far as the universities are concerned, the student rebellion seems to have had absolutely no lasting impact. And who would have expected that 15 years later that the rebellious students of 1968 would have become yuppies to whom Senator Hart appealed in the 1984 American primaries? The young, upward mobile, professional, ultra-materialistic, job-conscious, and maneuvering for their next promotion. There are actually far fewer dropouts around these days than there used to be. The only difference is the media pay attention to them. Can the emergence of homosexuals and lesbians pay attention to them? Can the emergence of homosexuals and lesbians into the limelight be explained by the student rebellion? They were certainly not the results the students themselves in the 1968, nor of any of the observers or prudents of those days could possibly have predicted. And yet, timing is of essence in exploiting changes in perception. Creative imitation, described in chapter 17, does not work. One has to be first. But precisely because it is so uncertain whether a change in perception is a fad or permanent, and what the consequences really are, perception-based innovation has to start small and very specific.